In the autumn of 1971, a mid-level CIA intelligence officer named Harlan Voss walked into a forest outside Charlottesville, Virginia, and did not come back the same man. He didn't come back injured. He didn't come back raving. He came back quiet. And in the intelligence community, quiet is the most alarming thing a man can become. Voss would resign within 8 months. He would spend the next 30 years refusing to speak. And then, in 2003, he spoke. What he described, a direct, sustained encounter with a non-human extraterrestrial entity in those Virginia woods, raises questions that the official record cannot answer, and refuses to try. Let's begin exactly where Harlan Voss begins in every account he ever gave. Not at a briefing room, not at a classified facility, not in some antiseptic government corridor lit by fluorescent tubes, in the woods, at night, alone. It was October 14th, 1971. Voss had driven out to a rural stretch of land near the Shenandoah foothills, a property he sometimes used for weekend retreats, a place he described in his 2003 recorded testimony as the only quiet place I had left. He was not on assignment. He was not carrying a weapon. He had a thermos of coffee, a wool blanket, and, by his own account, a particular kind of exhaustion that only men in that profession seem to accumulate. Not physical, but something deeper. A weariness of knowing things you wish you didn't know, and not knowing things you desperately wish you did. He set up near a dried creek bed, roughly a quarter-mile from where he'd parked his car. The sky was clear. The temperature had dropped sharply after sundown. He estimates it was somewhere between 11 p.m. and midnight when the forest went silent. Not gradually, all at once. He describes it in the 2003 testimony, a recording made for an independent researcher named Dr. Cecily Morn, who was at the time compiling oral histories of intelligence personnel for a privately funded archive, as a silence that was wrong. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something else. Like pressure, he says, like the air got thick and the animals understood something I didn't. Not yet. He saw the light first, not a beam, not a flash, a glow, pale and bluish white, moving between the trees at a height he estimated between 8 and 12 feet. It moved without sound. It moved without the kind of interruption you'd expect from something navigating dense forest. No branches snapping, no rustling, no variation in pace. It moved as if the trees were simply not there. And then it stopped. And Voss says he saw it, the entity, standing approximately 30 feet from him at the tree line. He uses the word grey without hesitation or irony. He is not performing. He has had 30 years to choose his words, and grey is the word he chooses. Roughly 4 feet tall, he estimates, proportionally thin in a way that struck him immediately as structural rather than malnourished, as if that body was simply built around different internal assumptions than a human body. The head was large, the eyes were large, no visible ears, a mouth that he describes as a horizontal line, present but apparently unused. It was standing still. It was looking at him, and Harlan Voss, a man who had spent 15 years in intelligence work, who had been trained in field operations, in psychological resilience, in the management of shock, did not move, could not move. He is careful to say, in the Morn recording, that this was not fear in the conventional sense. I wasn't afraid the way you're afraid of a car accident, he says. I was afraid the way you're afraid of suddenly understanding something that you cannot ununderstand. Once you encounter that phrasing, you don't forget it. What happens next is where the Voss account becomes something that professional skeptics cannot simply dismiss with the usual vocabulary. The contact, as Voss describes it, was not verbal. There was no sound, no light show, no physical approach. The entity remained at the tree line throughout. What Voss describes is something that most researchers, when they encounter his testimony for the first time, struggle to categorize. He calls it a transmission. Not a word, not a series of images exactly. Something more like, and here he pauses in the recording, and the pause goes on for a long time. Like having someone else's understanding placed inside your own mind, not their thoughts, their knowing. This raises a simple but critical question. What did it show him? Voss is specific, and that specificity is what makes this so difficult to dismiss. He says the entity transmitted 3 distinct categories of information. He did not ask for this information. He was not given a choice, and he is clear that the transmission was not painful, not frightening in itself, but that the content was what broke him, not the experience of contact, the content of it. The first category he describes as structural, a sense, more than an image, something like a full-body understanding, of scale. Not the scale of the universe in the way a textbook describes it. Something more unsettling. A sense of populated scale, of a cosmos that is not empty and silent, but occupied, layered, traversed. He says it lasted only seconds, but left him with the unshakable conviction that human civilization's understanding of its own solitude in the universe was not just incomplete, but deliberately maintained. Not by the entity, by something else, something closer to home. The second category is harder to articulate, and Voss struggles with it openly in the recording. He describes it as temporal, a sense of time that is not linear, not the theoretical physics notion of curved space-time. He's clear that he has no scientific framework for this, but something experiential. A feeling, he says, of having been seen from multiple points simultaneously. It wasn't looking at me now, he says. It was looking at me then, and before then, and from somewhere I don't have a word for. He says this left him with a sense of human history that he found profoundly destabilizing, not because history was wrong, but because it appeared in that moment observed, catalogued, watched over a very long arc by something with the patience and perspective to do so. And the third category, the one he returns to most reluctantly, the one he says he spent years trying to find another explanation for, was personal, specific. It showed him something about his own work, his own agency, the institution he had served for 15 years. He does not say what precisely it showed him. Not in the Morn recording, not anywhere, but he says this. It showed me that things I believed were secrets were not secrets from everyone, and things I believed were being done for protection were not being done for protection. And then he says, I never went back to that building. 8 months. That is how long it took Harlan Voss to formally resign from the agency after the night of October 14th, 1971. The gap itself is worth sitting with. Not a week, not a month, 8 months of showing up, 8 months of attending briefings, signing documents, performing normalcy. And then, in June of 1972, a letter of resignation that Dr. Morn obtained a copy of by me through what she describes in her archive notes only as a secondary source with direct access, which contains in its final paragraph a sentence that appears to have no bureaucratic precedent. I am no longer able to serve the functions of this office with the confidence that those functions serve the purposes I believed them to serve. That is not standard resignation language. That is a man trying to say something without saying it. The deeper you go into the administrative record surrounding Voss's departure, the more the official explanation begins to break apart. His personnel file, what fragments of it have circulated in research communities since the 1990s, indicates a performance review from March 1972, 4 months after the encounter, that describes him as increasingly non-responsive in collaborative settings and demonstrating apparent difficulty with information compartmentalization. That last phrase, difficulty with information compartmentalization. In intelligence work, that means a person is having trouble keeping secrets separate, trouble maintaining the walls between what they know and what they're permitted to act on. What does that look like after an experience like the one Voss describes? What does information compartmentalization even mean to a man who believes he has been shown in a single night that the compartments themselves are part of a larger structure he didn't design and cannot see from inside? former colleague of Voss's, a signals analyst who worked briefly in the same directorate and who agreed to speak to independent journalist Reuben Claith in 1998 under the pseudonym Dorset, described Voss in the months before his resignation as not erratic, not frightened, not unstable. He was just gone, like someone who has already made the decision and is simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. Not unstable, just gone. That distinction matters. Here is where the investigation becomes something I cannot look away from, no matter how much the skeptic in me keeps reaching for an exit. Harlan Voss is not singular. The pattern repeats with unsettling consistency across a series of documented cases that span from the late 1960s through the mid-1980s, a period of remarkable turbulence in American intelligence institutions, a period of internal investigations, external pressures, and a series of quiet, unexplained personnel departures that have never been fully accounted for by the official record. Consider the case of a Navy intelligence officer named Aldous Frick, stationed in 1969 at a communications monitoring post in rural Nevada, who reported in a private letter obtained by researcher Claith from Frick's estate after his death in 2001, a nighttime encounter with a small figure of non-terrestrial aspect near the perimeter fence of the facility. Frick was reassigned within 3 months. He retired early. He spent the last 20 years of his life writing a memoir that his family says was nearly complete at his death and has since disappeared. The memoir, gone. Or consider the testimony of a woman named Constance Wellesley, a document analyst who worked for a defense contractor with known agency contracts in the early 1970s, who told a researcher at a 1997 symposium in Flagstaff, Arizona, on the record, with her full name, that she had been shown during what she described as an involuntary contact experience in 1973. A visual record that I can only describe as a catalogue of human beings, going back much further than any history I was aware of. She lost her security clearance 18 months later. No official reason was ever given. She died in 2011. Her files, which she had reportedly organized for donation to a university archive, were never delivered. The files, gone. Not one case, not two, a series of them, encounters, departures, documents that vanish, and at the center of each one a consistent detail that I find impossible to ignore. None of these individuals reported the encounter through official channels, not one. They reported it privately years or decades later to independent researchers operating outside any institutional framework. They did not go to their superiors, they did not file reports. Why not? Why, in every case, did trained intelligence professionals, people whose entire professional existence was built around reporting, documenting, and analyzing, choose silence? Unless the silence was the rational choice. Unless they had reason to believe that reporting would not result in investigation, that it would result in something else entirely. And that's where the silence becomes impossible to ignore. I keep returning to what Voss describes as the content of the transmission, specifically the third category, the personal one, the one about his own institution. He won't say what it was, but he gives one additional detail in the Morn recording that he appears to offer almost accidentally, as if it slips out between more careful sentences. It wasn't showing me something I didn't know. It was showing me that I had known it all along and had been very carefully helped not to think about it. Helped not to think about it. That phrase lives in me. I've interviewed researchers, historians, former military personnel, people who have spent decades in proximity to these questions, and when I play them that clip, Voss's voice, quiet and steady, saying he had been helped not to think, the room always goes quiet. Because that is not the language of delusion. That is the language of a person describing a specific cognitive mechanism, a managed blind spot. Not ignorance, but structured ignorance, the kind that requires architecture, the kind that does not build itself. Dr. Morn, who passed away in 2017 and whose archive remains partially unpublished, wrote in her research notes a passage that her former graduate student shared with me, that the Voss testimony was unlike anything else in her 30 years of collecting accounts. Most witnesses describe being shown, she writes. Voss describes being reminded, as if the information was not new but recovered, as if the being was not revealing but restoring. Restoring. What does it mean to have something restored to you that you didn't know was missing? I've spent a considerable amount of time with the specific description Voss gives of the entity, and there are details that deserve more attention than they typically receive. He describes toward the end of the encounter, which he estimates lasted between 20 minutes and an hour, though he cannot reconcile that estimate with his memory of it, a specific gesture. The entity raised one hand, slowly. Not in greeting, he says, not a wave, more like an acknowledgement. The way you'd acknowledge someone you've been watching for a long time, he says. The way you'd acknowledge someone you expected to eventually look up. Expected to eventually look up. He says the encounter ended not with the entity leaving, but with the light, that same pale bluish-white glow, simply withdrawing. Not moving away through the trees, withdrawing as if dimming, as if stepping behind something invisible. And then the forest sounds returned, all at once, the same abrupt boundary on the other end that had marked the beginning. He walked back to his car. He sat there for, he thinks, 2 hours. He drove home. He did not tell his wife. He did not write anything down. He says he was afraid that writing it down would make it real in a way he wasn't ready for. When he finally did speak 32 years later, he was 71 years old and had been diagnosed with a terminal illness. He told Dr. Morn that he had waited until he had nothing left to lose, and then he said something that she marked in her notes with 3 underlines. The only thing I'm still afraid of is that no one will understand that I'm not trying to tell them something strange. I'm trying to tell them something obvious, that we have been seen, that we have always been seen, and that the only remarkable thing about that night was that for 20 minutes I was allowed to know it. Allowed to know it, not by the entity, he clarifies. The entity simply showed him. He means allowed by circumstance, by timing, by whatever combination of variables, his isolation, his state of exhaustion, his location, created conditions that he suspects are not frequently met. He suspects they are not frequently met. The official record contains no reference to Harlan Voss's encounter of October 14th, 1971. That is not surprising. It would be more surprising if it did. What the official record does contain, and in fragments, in peripheral documents, in the margins of administrative files, is a portrait of a man who functioned, who served, who was regarded as capable and professional, and who then became someone his colleagues described as absent, present in body, gone in some other harder-to-name way. And here is what I keep coming back to. Here is the detail that, once you notice it, reorganizes everything around it. The Voss account is not primarily a story about an alien encounter, or rather it is not only that. What Voss describes is an informational event, a transfer of knowledge. And the knowledge transferred was not about the extraterrestrials. It was not about their technology, their origin, their biology. It was about us, about human institutions, about what is known and by whom, and how the gap between those two things is maintained. The entity did not come to Harlan Voss with a message about itself. It came with a message about him, about us. What does that suggest about the nature of these encounters if the pattern holds? What does it suggest that, in case after case, the content of the transmission is not revelatory about the beings themselves, but revelatory about human systems, human blind spots, human structures of managed ignorance? What does it mean that the beings, whatever they are, wherever they come from, appear to be less interested in showing us themselves and more interested in showing us ourselves? Harlan Voss died in 2009. His estate was modest. His family has declined all interview requests. The Morn archive remains partially sealed, pending agreements that have been in negotiation, according to Dr. Morn's former student, for the better part of a decade. The woods outside Charlottesville are still there. The dried creek bed is still there. Whatever walked out of those trees on October 14th, 1971, whatever stood at the tree line and looked at a tired intelligence officer and decided, for reasons we cannot know, that this was the moment to reach across whatever distance separates us, it left no physical trace, no burn marks, no ground disturbances, no anomalous readings of any kind, nothing that science could point to and say, here, something happened here. Only a man who came back quiet, only a career that ended in a letter that doesn't sound like a resignation, only a series of cases separated by years and geography, connected by nothing except the shape of what was lost, not memory, not sanity, but something harder to name. A previous relationship to certainty, a previous ability to hold the walls up between what you know and what you're permitted to act on. What do you do with knowledge you were never supposed to have? What do you do when the beings who gave it to you are gone and the institution you serve doesn't want it and the world isn't asking for it? What happens to the truth that falls in the woods, with no one there but one exhausted man and something that had been watching us for longer than we know how to count? What do we lose when the people who were shown something choose, or are made, to go quiet? And what, still waiting in those archives, in those sealed files, in those undelivered memoirs and disappeared documents, what is still trying to reach us? What has always been trying to reach us? What, if we finally stopped looking away, would we find that we already knew?